Now I will move on and deal with the issue of termination, uh, which is the main subject matter of our webinar today. Now, let me first take you through the forms of termination of an employment contract in Malaysia. An employment contract can be terminated through various forms. One is through the dismissal of an employee by the employer. So, for example, the employer finds that the employee has committed some acts of misconduct, or the employee has been a non-performing employee. The employee has failed to meet his or her KPIs, etc. So the employer decides to exercise its rights of termination by terminating the employment contract entered into with the employee. Another way in which an employment contract can be terminated, this is very common, through the resignation of the employee. So for example, as an employee, you have decided that you want to leave your current job, perhaps you have got another offer, or you want to look at another form of employment. You can then tender your resignation as provided for under your contract of employment, and you can bring the contract to an end. Your employment contracts will usually have a notice period which you would have to serve. Usually it's between 1 to about 3 months, depending on the position you hold and the number of years you have served the company. So you can bring your employment contract to an end by serving a notice of resignation. Another way in which an employment contract can be brought to an end is through the mutual consent of the employer and the employee. So for example, the employer and the employee come to an agreement and they say, look, we would like to end the employment contract. We would like to bring it to an end. They can do so through a mutual consent. And this is usually in the form of a mutual separation scheme or a mutual separation agreement, where for a certain reason, the employer and the employee decide, okay, let's bring an end to the employment contract. Another way in which an employment contract can be brought to an end is through the expiry of a fixed-term employment contract. Like I explained to you earlier, a fixed-term employment is where you employ a person for a specific duration, a specific period of time. And once that period of time has lapsed, the employment contract is automatically terminated. It automatically comes to an end unless it is renewed. And another way in which an employment contract can come to an end is through the operation of the law. For example, the employment contract is frustrated. I will explain this to you shortly. Now, let's deal with the first aspect, which is termination of an employment contract through the dismissal of an employee by the employer. Now, under the law, an employer has the right to hire and fire. The power to dismiss an employee is considered to be the prerogative of the employer. So an employer is entitled to hire or fire any person it deems fit for the effective and viable running of its operations, of its business. However, if an employer decides to dismiss an employee, the dismissal must be with just cause or excuse, as provided for under Section 20 of our Industrial Relations Act 1967. So whilst an employer has a right to fire an employee for the effective and viable running of its business, it must ensure that it only terminates its employee in justifiable circumstances, failing which the termination would be held to be unlawful. And of course, an employee may be dismissed from employment on various grounds. And this includes, but it's not limited to a situation where the employee commits acts of misconduct or the employee is a non-performing employee. He or she fails to perform a job scope. But there are, of course, various other grounds in which an employee may be dismissed. Now, I would like to deal with the issue of misconduct. Now, misconduct is the most common ground for dismissal in Malaysia and in fact throughout the world. Most employees who are dismissed, who are terminated by their employer are usually done on the grounds of misconduct, where the where the employee has done something so wrong in breach of their terms of the employment. Misconduct basically concerns the unacceptable behavior of an employee during his employment with the company. So, for example, an employee who is absent from work for a period of time without prior leave, without permission from the employer, an employee who is habitually late to work. So, for example, your working hours are from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., but the employee regularly comes in at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning. So it's habitually late. That may be a ground that would constitute a misconduct entitling an employer to terminate the contract. Or there are other instances of unacceptable behavior by the employee. For example, committing theft, sexual harassment at work. So there are various grounds in which an employer may terminate an employee for misconduct. Now, whether or not an employee has committed an act of misconduct, of course, depends on the facts and circumstances of each individual case. And in order for the employer to terminate an employee for misconduct, the employer must, of course, prove that the employee has indeed committed such misconduct, and the employee was given an opportunity to answer these allegations of misconduct. And upon hearing the employee, it is established, yes, the employee has indeed committed these acts of misconduct, then the employer may terminate the employee. I will come to the procedure of termination a bit later. Let me just deal with this issue of termination first. Now, like I mentioned earlier, examples of misconduct are like insubordination, absenteeism, even drug abuse. There have been cases where the employee has been found to have been in possession of dangerous drugs or consuming drugs. This is, of course, a serious misconduct which entitles the employer to terminate the employee. Theft, like I mentioned, dishonesty, sexual harassment, and the list goes on. Another ground in which an employer may terminate an employee is incompetence, where the employee fails to perform. An employer is, of course, not bound to retain an employee who has demonstrated poor work performance. But however, ladies and gentlemen, this is very, very important. An employer should refrain from terminating an employee just because he or she has performed poorly, unless sufficient opportunity has been given to the employee to improve his or her performance. And after these opportunities have been given, and yet the employee fails in his or her duties, then the employer may consider exercising the right of termination. But please remember, when it comes to poor performance, incompetence, the employer should always give sufficient opportunity to the employee to correct himself or herself. And the employee must be warned that if he or she fails to improve his or her performance, then he or she faces the risk of termination.